Hello and welcome to the All Monitor Brief. It's Friday, June 28th. I'm Kristen Tolman. Today's main segment is a conversation with Jared Szuba, All Monitor's Pentagon correspondent, on the crisis heating up at Israel's northern border between the Israeli forces and Iran-backed Hezbollah. But first, let's get you caught up in the headlines. Gazans are forced to live in bombed-out buildings or camp next to giant piles of trash, a United Nations spokesperson said Friday, denouncing the unbearable conditions in the besieged territory. At a polling station in central Tehran, Iranian voters formed a long line to cast their ballots for a new president, while others sat in a nearby park, shunning a process they have lost faith in. The Financial Action Task Force, the Paris-based body that monitors countries' susceptibility to money laundering and terrorism financing, removed Turkey Friday from its gray list of countries it's watching for illicit activities. And Hezbollah said it fired dozens of rockets Thursday at a military base in northern Israel in retaliation for Israeli strikes on Lebanon, announcing 4 of its fighters had been killed. Now, on to the main segment. Hey, Jared, welcome to the All Monitor Brief.
Hi, Kristen. Thank you for having me.
So, Jared, you are the Pentagon correspondent. You're based in D.C. You're watching very closely as the conflict is brewing on Israel's northern border with Lebanon and Iran's backed Hezbollah. The U.S. is urging for diplomacy, and Israeli's defense minister Gallant was in town this week, and the U.S. special envoy Hochstein was in Beirut last week. What do you think of these messages that are being sent from the U.S. side to both the Israelis and then the government in Lebanon, and will they be received and ultimately factored in?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think it's crystal clear that the United States does not want to see this conflict happen, and that there is a good chance that it could be even more destructive than what we've seen in Gaza. You saw earlier this week the U.S. Secretary of Defense offering a particularly pointed warning about, this could cause a wider regional conflict for the Middle East, and it would be catastrophic for Lebanon, and that innocent lives on both sides of the border in Israel and in Lebanon would be paying the price for this. So I think it's quite clear what the U.S. position is. As for whether or not the message will be received, look, actors on both sides of the border, Hezbollah and, of course, Israeli leaders, they're going to do what's in their strategic interest. In Israel, you have more than 60,000 at a minimum Israeli citizens who have been unable to return to their homes in the country's north because of these cross-border strikes. And Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah has publicly bragged about creating a de facto buffer zone inside Israel. That would be completely unacceptable to any Israeli government, let alone, a politically vulnerable one like Netanyahu's, which is, reeling from, arguably the worst security crisis in Israel's history, or one of them. As for Hezbollah, I think Hezbollah leadership is aware, very aware, that a full-blown war with Israel would mean massive destruction for its forces and capabilities, but also for Lebanon itself, which is already facing its own economic crisis, which is the worst in that country's history. But for Israelis to be able to safely return to their homes, they're going to need either a decisive, what is portrayed politically as a decisive Israeli victory over Hezbollah, or in the border area at least, or a clear gesture from Hezbollah that the attacks are going to stop. Now, Hassan Nasrallah has indicated that a permanent ceasefire in Gaza is a prerequisite for the Hezbollah cross-border attacks to stop. But barring a sort of surprise Israeli operation that kills Yahya Sinwar or finds other top Hamas leaders in Gaza, it's looking pretty unlikely in the immediate future that we're going to see a Gaza ceasefire, at least in the next week or two.
Yeah, and this week in your security briefing, you laid out 4 possible scenarios. Can you walk me through just the 30-second snippet of each?
Sure, yes. Before that, I will just say, ultimately, whether or not, this conflict breaks out, it may boil down to Israeli leaders' interpretation of how much support the Biden administration is willing to provide them in a full-blown war or an operation with Hezbollah. Against Hezbollah, excuse me. The Biden administration says they support Israel's defense, but they haven't unfrozen the paused shipment of 2,000-pound bombs for now. Though if war breaks out, I think it's very likely that the Biden administration will unfreeze everything and continue to transfer Iron Dome interceptors, which are, of course, made in the U.S. But, there are significant concerns in Washington that, Israel's Iron Dome batteries could be overwhelmed if Hezbollah, which has the largest rocket and missile arsenal of any non-state actor in the world, goes all in to defend itself. So, earlier this week, over the past weekend, you saw the Pentagon's top general, CQ Brown, explicitly warning that, this that a sort of U.S. organized defense of Israeli airspace, like we saw back in April with the Iranian projectile attack on Israel, may not be as effective in case of a war with Hezbollah because of the shorter range, shorter distance between Lebanon and northern Israel. So these are all things to keep in mind. As for the scenarios, sure, I've spoken to a number of current and former officials, as well as multiple experts on the dynamics in Lebanon. What I wrote, I think these are not exhaustive, and they're certainly not exclusive, hypothetical scenarios. I think the two worst case paths that could come out of our current moment is that, one, if Israeli leaders were to, sort of buck American warnings and concerns and sort of decide to risk a preemptive war to disable Hezbollah, to set back its capabilities a decade or so. I mean, Hezbollah has arguably, by some of the estimates I've seen, probably 10 times as many projectile weapons than it did back in before the 2006 brief Israeli campaign against Hezbollah, the previous war that the two fought. So this is something that Israeli leaders openly say they cannot tolerate on their northern border. You would likely, in that case, I mean, this would really be a worst case scenario. In that case, you'd likely see thousands and thousands and thousands of Israeli airstrikes in southern Lebanon within the first 24, 48 hours. You may see potentially, worst case scenario, Israeli attempts to preempt Hezbollah precision strikes into Israeli population centers like Haifa, and doing that by potentially knocking out what they see as Hezbollah command and control nodes, leadership. It's not out of the question that if Israel decides to go all in on this with a preemptive war, that they might target Hezbollah leadership, perhaps even Hassan Nasrallah himself. Now, that's a very dangerous game to be playing, because there's U.S. officials are concerned that Iran would militarily get involved to preserve Hezbollah's capabilities and strength, and that would likely drag in the United States as well, which is really something the Biden administration has prioritized avoiding in this Gaza crisis. Another scenario that would be, one of the worst case scenarios would be, a continuation of the status quo of strike, counter-strike across the border on a daily basis. But instead of, well, both sides have been, apparently seem to be being very cautious to avoid civilian casualties for the most part, generally speaking, that there is a chance that a mistake could be made, that an errant strike could hit a bus or, a private residence, kill a number of civilians, and from there things escalate, and then civilians are killed on both sides. And as casualties mount, you have, again, either the Israeli side or Hezbollah attempting to escalate to sort of to head off further escalation, but accidentally triggering, a worse spiral that neither side can control. So that's a concern. That's a possibility that U.S. officials have publicly aired concerns about. Another third potential scenario could be a limited Israeli campaign in rural areas of southern Lebanon, both air and ground operations, in an attempt to push Hezbollah's rocket, drone, and Radwan forces some 10 kilometers back from the border, to basically force a buffer zone, which was essentially never created, though it was supposed to be under a UN Security Council resolution following the 2006 war. That's also U.S. officials also see that as an incredibly risky move. You saw earlier this week, last weekend, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, CQ Brown, suggested that Iran might get involved in such an offensive. So Al Monitor's Ben Caspit reported today that Defense Minister Gallant pitched just such a limited operation plan, sought to shop this around Washington with top U.S. national security officials during his visit earlier this week, and that he was rejected. Now, Pentagon officials are refusing to publicly confirm the contents of these discussions. But I think it's quite clear that they are opposed to that sort of scenario as well. One, because U.S. officials say Iran, as mentioned, and other proxy militias in Iraq and Syria are likely to militarily intervene. Two, it would likely thwart Western proposals to negotiate a buffer zone through diplomacy. And into that buffer zone, eventually, the U.S. and French would oversee, a deployment of the Lebanese armed forces to bolster, existing UN peacekeeping troops in that area after a Hezbollah withdrawal, and even a limited conflict in this area could really throw the wrench into gears of that diplomacy. So yeah, that would be another scenario, and then a final scenario, which unfortunately at this time seems, I think the one everyone is hoping for, but I think most acknowledge it's one of the least likely, is either a ceasefire in Gaza. Or a wind down of Israeli operations in Gaza allows Hassan Nasrallah to claim that, the Islamic resistance and Hezbollah has ended the war in Gaza, and now they can stand down and the attacks will stop. Unfortunately, that's seen as not likely. One, on the one hand, because of the existing gap between Hamas and Prime Minister Netanyahu's government on achieving a ceasefire. And two, because Hassan Nasrallah has openly said that the attacks won't stop until there is a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. So unless it can be finessed diplomatically by U.S. and French and Lebanese diplomats, it's looking like we are on a collision course right now.
Wow. Jared, what should we be looking out for in the week ahead that could possibly signal, and as you say, it's not just one or the other, but what should we be looking out for that might give us some clues into which direction things continue to head?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say more than just the coming week. I would say the next 3 to 5 weeks. I think, others have pointed out that the month of July is really going to be key here. Prime Minister Netanyahu has said that, intensive operations in Gaza are going to start winding down. And the sources and analysts whom I've spoken to have suggested that the IDF, may need as many as, 3-5 weeks, maybe 6 weeks to sort of, prepare for a potential offensive in the north. So you're going to continue to see signs of Israeli military preparations. You're going to see speeches by Israeli commanders. You're going to see, further chest beating from Israeli national security officials and likely from Hezbollah's leaders as well. It would be interesting to see how quickly the ground operations in Gaza wind down and which units are mobilized when and where. I think it's also important to keep an eye on the diplomacy that's going on, not behind closed doors, but more quietly than the sort of posturing on both sides. Amos Hochstein, the Biden administration's lead envoy on these negotiations, is headed to Paris. So I would keep an eye on both the French and the U.S. diplomatic tracks on this, and look for any statements out of Beirut as well in the Lebanese press on the progress of things.
Jared, thank you so much for your reporting, and we'll make sure to check back in as the weeks move on.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me.
That's it for today, June 28th. You can read all these stories and more impacting the region at allmonitor.com.